this talk is different than I think a lot of the other talks you've seen. This is sort of putting together some ideas around, how an economist should be thinking about some of the innovation in precision medicines. Not all precision medicines are orphan drugs, and not all orphan drugs are precision medicines, but there is a growing intersection between orphan drugs and precision medicines. Orphan drugs, at least in the US, are drugs that help patients who have diseases with fewer than 200,000 patients in them. So there's a connection between orphan drugs and precision medicines, because as we start to salami slice a big disease into smaller diseases using genomic and proteomic biomarkers, the disease is more likely, or the drug is more likely to qualify for the protections of the Orphan Drug Act. And I'll tell you more about the Orphan Drug Act and what it means, but I'm not trying to claim that everything that is happening here today on precision medicine comes under the purview of the Orphan Drug Act. The Orphan Drug Act is 35 years old. The US passed it in the early 1980s, and it provides a number of incentives to induce companies to bring orphan drugs to market. And as Steve said in his talk, just to illustrate sort of an example of an orphan drug, this is Luxturna. Luxturna, there are many orphan drugs. This is just an example of a new one that has received a lot of attention. Luxturna was brought to market by Sparks Therapeutics, and the CEO of Sparks Therapeutics is a former student. It only works for patients who have a certain type of inherited blindness. So it doesn't work in all patients with inherited blindness. It works in patients who have inherited blindness because of mutations in both copies of the RP65 gene being defective. There's about 1,000 of these patients every year in the US, just so you know. So it's not just an orphan disease, or an ultra-orphan disease, or an ultra-ultra-orphan disease. There's 1,000 patients a year who develop this condition. Now, Luxturna sells for $850,000, right? And it has no competitor right now. If you can't afford the $850,000 because your insurer won't cover it, then you can buy Luxturna for one eye for half the price. So this raises a lot of questions on the pricing model. Now, Sparks Therapeutics actually is just sold for $5 billion. So you might be thinking, well, orphan drugs, wow, small population, not a whole lot of money to be made. And I think the point that I'm going to try to make is, yes, but if the manufacturer is able to capture the value of their innovation in the form of higher prices, then do we as society need to provide further incentives to induce innovation in orphan drugs? And I'm going to argue that if your company is worth $5 billion and you're selling your drug for $850,000, why do we as US taxpayers need to protect you even more? Because the original purpose of the Orphan Drug Act was to bring drugs to market where, in the absence of the ODA, the drug was just not going to be economically viable. So we were trying to create economic viability by saying either we'll give you R&D tax credits or we will protect a generic form coming in for about 7 years instead of the usual 3 or 5 years. So that's our usual thinking, but our point is, as the drugs become better, as the manufacturers are able to target their drugs better to the patients who benefit most from them, then a lot of these orphan drugs will become economically viable. So that's sort of the broad theme of this talk. I'll provide you with a little bit more color here. I think people get very upset about Luxturna, or they get very excited about Luxturna, but Luxturna is a very small innovation compared to what's in the pipeline. So this is from the Editas website. Editas is a biotech company which is about 1.5 miles away from me. It was founded by the Broad Institute of Harvard and MIT. The Broad Institute owns many of the patents to do CRISPR-Cas9 editing in humans. Those patents were developed and owned at the Broad. Broad is a collaboration of Harvard, MIT, and the Harvard hospitals. And the Broad created a for-profit company to bring those patents, to bring the therapeutics associated with those patents to market. Now, if you look at the Editas pipeline, and you look at what are they doing, they're doing things like CRISPR-Cas9 for Usher syndrome, CRISPR-Cas9 for beta thalassemia, CRISPR-Cas9 for muscular Duchenne's, CRISPR-Cas9 for cystic fibrosis. So they're working on diseases that are monogenic in nature, where there's like a single mutation that if I could edit somehow, I could in theory cure the disease. They're a long way away from actually giving us cures. But the point is, this R&D has started. And Editas is a publicly traded company, right? So Editas has no product, they haven't brought anything to market, but they're worth over $1 billion. And one reason that they're worth over $1 billion is because financial markets know that, you know, if you adjust for the probability of failure, if these guys are successful, their drugs will not retail for $850,000. They'll probably retail for $3 and $4 million, right? I mean, if you cure hepatitis, if you cure cystic fibrosis, I don't think one would be charging $850,000. I think the person with CF, who is now living to be 35 and not the greatest health, would live to be not 45 or 55, but could live to be 85 or 95 and die of all the things that we might die of, right? So the price of generating 70 years of life will not be $850,000. Like, I think the manufacturers know what they will charge at. So I think but these are all ultra-orphan conditions. These are all orphan drugs. They would all be protected by the protections of the ODA, but these companies are clearly economically viable. Okay. Here's some facts on the Orphan Drug Act. So these are the approvals by the FDA over time. And you can see in blue that the FDA approves somewhere between 25, 30, 40 drugs on average in a given year. And on the right panel, you can see the number of drugs that are orphan drugs. So you can see somewhere between a third to a half of all the drugs being approved in the United States are orphan drugs, right? So this is not like a little, even though it was meant to be for economically non-viable products, clearly we're seeing a lot of innovation in these orphan drugs. So you might ask, what are these orphan drugs? What do these orphan drugs look like? I've told you about Luxturna, I've told you about these future orphan drugs. The EU does a very nice job of telling us what the distribution of orphan drugs look like. About a third of them are for rare cancers. About a third of them. Very, very, very rare cancers, right? So multiple myeloma would be an example of an orphan, a drug that qualifies for orphan designation. Some of them are for rare neurological diseases like spinal muscular atrophy, like muscular Duchenne's. And some of them are for things like rare blood disorders and things like that. You can see that there's a lot of orphan drug development in the preclinical and phase 1 trials. So this is just a way of saying, 10, 15 years from now, these drugs will start to come to market. And you can see over time that there's been a huge increase in the number of drugs that have received orphan designation after the Human Genome Project was completed, right? So this is key to the argument because we sequenced the human genome, and that is what allowed manufacturers and scientists to understand disease better, understand that there are 1,800 different ways you can get cystic fibrosis, depending on which mutation causes cystic fibrosis. But now in theory, I can build different drugs for different mutations of cystic fibrosis. I couldn't have done that earlier prior to the Human Genome Project. So the underlying economic model for this kind of R&D is a very simple economic model, right? So I could write it down mathematically, but I'll just say it to you. We have this view that a pharmaceutical company will undertake R&D as long as the expected profits from doing the R&D, launching the drug, exceed some threshold. The threshold is sort of the cost of capital that company is facing in financial markets. So what matters for expected profit? Expected profit just depends on sort of three things, right? It depends on how much did it cost to do the R&D. It does depend on that. It does depend on the revenues, if my drug is successful, and it depends on failure rates. The revenues depend on two things. It depends on the price I can charge and the number of people that I can sell the drug to. So with the orphan drug, I don't have a whole lot of people I can sell the drug to, so that's very small. It is very, very small. but maybe because the drug is good, or because I know exactly who those patients are, and as a result of knowing exactly who those patients are, I also know their exact willingness to pay. I can charge a very high price. So this very simple model you can see in this very simple one-line model of how firms think, you can kind of see right away that in general you would expect expected profits to be small for rare diseases and orphan diseases, but there's a world in which if I can price my product at the full willingness to pay for that product, and more importantly, I can identify that willingness to pay with the genomic or proteomic biomarker, then maybe, just maybe, some of these drugs are actually economically viable in the absence of the drug, in the absence of the protections. So here's what the incentives for orphan drugs look like around the world. In the US, we passed the ODA in 1983. We define it as saying, drugs that target patients that have conditions where there's fewer than 200,000 people with that condition. How did we come up with 200,000? This is a typical US Congress thing to do. A bunch of lobbyists went to Congress and said, the 200,000 people have narcolepsy. The narcolepsy guys really wanted their drug to receive orphan designation, so 200,000 was chosen as the cutoff. So there was no science. There's no science, why did we not use 50,000? Why did we not use 1 million? There was no, if you're a clinician, you're thinking 200,000, there must be some science. No, there was no science behind the 200,000. And what we do in the US is we say, look, we do two things. We give you 7 years of market exclusivity. So 7 years after your drug has been approved by the FDA, we will prevent a generic or a biosimilar from entering. But we will also allow you to write off 50% of the R&D associated with the drug development. Now this will be important, right? I'll come back to this R&D tax credit. The R&D tax credit is interesting because it's saying, we want to make your drug economically viable. So we're doing two things. We're giving you monopoly power by preventing competition, but we're also effectively lowering the cost of doing the R&D by giving you the R&D tax credit. And if you read the Internal Revenue Service's guidelines to, tax inspectors, they're told explicitly not to challenge the cost estimate from the pharma company. So if the pharma company says, I built Luxturna cost me $2 billion to make, or $1 billion, it's not saying that you can't challenge the pharma company, but the view is the pharma company knows its cost structure, and somehow the view is also that it will report it correctly, which I don't know where that falls. but it's a big deal. And as you know, we don't really know much about R&D costs. We don't really know. We know the Demasi number is $2 billion, but that's for the typical drug from the typical biotech, from the typical big pharma company. We don't know about these small orphan drugs. There are reasons to think that orphan drug R&D is more expensive because you have to find these patients. It takes you very long to find the patients, and for those of you who are involved in clinical trials, you know that one of the biggest costs of doing the clinical trial is not the drug, it's finding the patients. On the other hand, you could argue that orphan drugs are easier to make for two reasons. One is you understand the disease better. It's not a disease like diabetes, it's not a disease like Alzheimer's. It has many, causes behind it. It has a very particular kind of mechanism or etiology, like, both copies of RPE65 are mutated. You just have to go after RPE65 mutations. That might mean that orphan R&D is actually easier. It could also be that even though the patients are smaller, it's easier to find them because they're all connected through patient advocacy groups. It could be that the R&D is easier to do for a third reason, which is that the FDA is willing to approve a lot of orphan drugs based on surrogate endpoints. So you don't have to show that you improved survival. You don't have to show that Luxturna was a cure for blindness. You just have to show that there was some improvement, self-reported improvement in the patient's ability to say that he or she could see better. Right? Yeah.
Is price discrimination allowed?
Oh yeah. So my talk is about price discrimination. So I'm going to get to price discrimination. Thank you for asking that. Yeah, I'll show you how that works in this industry. Absolutely. Okay, so the U.S. Congress in December of last year, by last year I don't mean 2018, I mean 2017, got, our Congress doesn't like taxes. So the tax cut is something that, this was sort of annoying Congress. So what they did was they reduced the ability of pharma companies to write off 50% of their R&D expenses. They reduced that to 25%. I'm going to come back to this point in a little bit at the end of the talk, but keep it in your mind because I'm going to argue at the end of the talk, despite everything I said, that was a mistake. Okay, so I'll talk about why that is. In Japan, the Orphan Drug Act passes 10 years later. They protect orphan drugs from competition for 10 years, right? So it's a much bigger protection from generics and biosimilars, and they do allow you to write off up to 50% of the R&D costs. Now remember, a pharma company knows how to write it off here and write it off here, right? There's no law that says that, like, if you're Sparks Therapeutics, you can't get the write-off in the US and the write-off in Japan. So there's no tax coordination here. You could write off a lot of R&D, finding opportunities to write off R&D. So this is like just a separate aside about what happens when you don't have international tax coordination. The EU passes it in 2000, different threshold for orphan drug status. They do a prevalence threshold, 10 years, and your ability to claim the tax credit varies across member states. Okay, so that's the background in terms of what we do. And so the question I want to ask in this talk is essentially, this question. We have these incentives for orphan drugs. Are they too generous? Maybe they were not too generous when we passed the Orphan Drug Act, but might they be too generous right now in an era of precision medicines? I don't know the answer to that. I'm going to provide you with some information suggesting that maybe these incentives are too generous, and I would love to have a dialogue with you, a discussion with you on what I might be missing, because I'm quite open-minded about this. Now, there's 4 reasons why I think these incentives may be too generous, and I've hinted at all 4 of them. The first is that pricing dynamics have changed, right? And in particular, when you have a genomic and proteomic basis to the drug working, you might be able to engage in price discrimination. You might be able to charge patients who the drug works differently in patients who have different indications and people who have different sort of mutations. And so what you could do as a manufacturer is charge different prices to people in whom the drug works than whom the drug works less well. So maybe take Luxturna, it works great for people who have 2 mutations of RPE65. You charge them a high price. There's many other mutations that will give you inherited blindness. In those patients, we don't know if Luxturna works. But a payer or a patient might be willing to say, we'll pay, we'll take the risk, we'll take the chance. Maybe it works really badly, but it works a little bit. But I can practice price discrimination. I can say, well, this patient has inherited blindness, but it's not from RPE65 mutations. I will charge them a lower price, because if I charge them the higher price, they're going to not say it was worth it, right? So I have much more ability to price discriminate if I can observe the indication that the drug is being used in. The second is something that the pharma companies are doing a lot more of. They're seeking they're seeking orphan indications for drugs that have non-orphan uses. What does that mean? That means that I have a drug, it has 2 indications. One is a huge indication, like rheumatoid arthritis. So Humira is the world's most successful drug today. Humira made its manufacturer at $17 billion last year alone. Humira has been around for a long time. $17 billion, clearly economically viable. Why is it economically viable? It's a good drug, it's used in rheumatoid arthritis. Rheumatoid arthritis is not an orphan condition. Everybody has rheumatoid arthritis, everywhere. But Humira has 5 orphan indications. And because Humira has 5 orphan indications, the manufacturer is able to benefit from the R&D tax credit because of the fact that those 5 orphan indications are legitimate. right? They weren't gained by the manufacturer in some sense. The third reason is that it's my view that in some of these markets, even after the patents expire, and even after the exclusivity periods expire, the market is so small that it's like a natural monopoly market. Like no one will enter. So let's say that the patents were free in the public domain, anyone could enter. There's still a high cost of building the manufacturing plant, because you're talking about drugs for 1,000 people. In that world, the manufacturer will be a monopolist forever. And if the manufacturer will be a monopolist forever, or for a very long time, let me put it that way, do we really need to subsidize the creation of that monopolist? That monopolist is clearly economically viable because they're a monopolist, right? So I want to test this third hypothesis, that in some of these orphan indications, we are seeing less follow-on entry by generic companies because the markets are smaller. And if the markets are smaller, maybe what we need to be thinking about is actually price regulation of these companies after the patents expire. So I don't want to do that before. I don't know how to price. I don't want to regulate companies that are doing innovation. But after the patents have expired, after the exclusivity has expired, maybe we want to regulate these companies just like we would regulate another natural monopolist through some cost-based regulation. That's a hypothesis. I don't know if I'm right on this. And then finally, the point I made earlier, perhaps the incentives in the Orphan Drug Act are too generous because there have been changes in the technology of drug development. And this could go in either direction. Maybe orphan drugs are harder to make. That's actually a reason to subsidize them more. Maybe they're easier to make because of our willingness to include them on surrogate endpoints and the fact that the patient advocacy groups connect large groups of patients to pharmaceutical companies who need to do the clinical trials. So in some sense, it's actually very hard for pharma companies to find Alzheimer's patients because even though Alzheimer's is a huge disease, we don't have a good, clean diagnosis of Alzheimer's. When people get Alzheimer's, they often go to gerontologists, and gerontologists are usually not plugged into the world of clinical trials the way oncologists are. You could argue that actually in Alzheimer's, even though it's a huge condition, it's harder to do the first wave of trials than it is to do trials in multiple myeloma, because in multiple myeloma, you have the patient advocacy group called the Multiple Myeloma Research Foundation. Right? And again, that's a hypothesis. I don't know the answer to that, but that's what I wanted to put out there for you. Okay? So this is what the talk will be about, is just give you a little bit of information on these four things. On the pricing dynamics point, let me just motivate it very simply. This is showing you the Lorenz curve, in a sense, where on the x-axis I have for all the drugs that we're seeing, the cumulative share of total drug volume. So volume just means number of units sold. And on the y-axis is the cumulative share of sales from these drugs. And what you can see is that there are a handful of drugs which account for very little of the volume. So they might only account for 5 or 10% of the volume, but you can see back in even 1995, right, they accounted for about 30% of the sales. 10% of the volume, 30% of the sales. But you come fast forward to 2015, 10% of the sales, 10% of the volume, 50% of the sales. Right? This is a way of saying, this is just a very simple way of saying that some of these small market drugs, we know that they're small market as measured by number of units, number of patients, but they're still big in terms of the prices that they're charging, and that ability has increased over time. A lot of this has to do with the growing use of genomic and proteomic biomarkers in the clinical trials themselves. So this is some work that I did with Craig Garthwaite at the Kellogg School at Northwestern and Ariel Stern, who's my colleague at Harvard Business School. And what we find was, looking at sort of all the drugs under development, if you look at drugs that are under development in phase 1 over time, now about a little less than 9% of them have one of these genomic or proteomic things in the label itself. Basically saying this drug works in people with this particular kind of mutation, which is what will allow for the price discrimination down the road. I think another way to see this is just, you can see our understanding at a genetic level of different large cancers has evolved pretty dramatically over the past 20 years. If you look at these are the 5 big cancers, right? So melanoma, prostate, colon, breast, non-small cell lung cancer. In 1996, if someone had non-small cell lung cancer, we said they had non-small cell lung cancer. Fast forward 20 years later, and we're talking about all these different, like PD-1 way of kind of manifestation of non-small cell lung cancer, or you may have a BRAF mutation. In breast cancer, it's been really kind of impressive to see our kind of understanding of different types of breast cancer arising from different types of driver mutations. But all of that is giving the manufacturer the ability to build a better drug for your particular mutation, but also then charge a different price if you have that mutation. So let's see how this would work in practice, right? In practice, this is how it works. This is a complicated slide. You're all economists, so you'll understand it. Actually, you're all economists, or you're not all economists, right? So you're not economists. Okay, so I'll slow down. How many of you? Okay, wait. I need to know this because otherwise it's just gonna, this is gonna be the heart of the whole talk. So let me just ask for a show of hands. How many of you are non-economists or economists who've forgotten all their economics? So, okay. Yeah, so that's great. Okay, and the rest of you are economists. So we will do this very slowly. So you heard this question earlier about price discrimination. Price discrimination is this idea that I'm charging different customers different prices based on their willingness to pay. But it does require me to know differences in their willingness to pay. It's why Gilead, that sells a cure for Hep C, charges a much higher price in the US than it does in Egypt or in India, because it knows that Egyptian patients and Indian patients have lower willingness to pay. It figures out their maximum willingness to pay, it sells it to them at a lower price. We're talking about a different kind of price discrimination. We're talking about the drug, a drug. The drug can be used in a lot of different indications, so maybe in different types of cancer. Maybe it's a drug that works in lung cancer, breast cancer, colon cancer, but it works really well in colon cancer, but not so well in breast cancer. A good example of this would be Avastin, bevacizumab, made by Genentech. Bevacizumab doesn't work actually in breast cancer. Some people would say it actually may not even be safe in breast cancer. Let's just say it works very, very little in breast cancer, but it actually works quite well, in colon cancer, even though it has some horrible side effects for people with colon cancer. It is like a good drug for people with colon cancer. So indication-based pricing is this idea that the manufacturer will charge a higher price for Avastin for a patient with colon cancer than a patient who has breast cancer. Of course, this requires that the manufacturer be able to tell what indication the patient has. If the manufacturer can't tell, and if the doctors and the patients can lie about what indication the patient has, then I can't do this indication-based pricing.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
When you are talking about price discrimination, you are talking about price discrimination to patients or to patients
Yes.
in general?
Yeah, so I'm going to keep saying patients, but I mean mostly to their insurers. Mostly to their insurers. The patient may not see what's happening, but the insurer could be charged a different price. That price would not flow down to the individual patient, but would flow to the risk pool for sure. Right, so all the premiums would increase, for example. By the way, I think this is an interesting example of a question in precision medicine that economists, I think, could do more work in. If you believe what I said, and I don't know if I'm right on this, it would predict that pharma companies over time, biotech companies in particular, have a strong incentive to actually acquire the diagnostic companies. I think we'll start to see a wave of vertical integration, because if you own the diagnostic company, then no one can lie to you about what indication the patient has, right? And I think you're starting to see some of that.
And it's starting pretty much.
Yeah, and I think that, so what I'm going to show you will just become even more strong over time as we start to see this kind of vertical integration.
The biotechs are developing both the partner diagnostic and the cure.
Yeah, so they want the companion diagnostic and the cure, exactly, right? Because one, they have the companion diagnostics, so they can find the disease. That's what they keep saying. They say, oh, there's an unmet need, we need to find the disease, we need to find the disease. No one will find this orphan disease, we need to find it, that's why we need to own the companion diagnostic. But I think Richard, very much, my view is that that's true, but behind it is this other view if I find it, I know how much my drug will work in that patient versus another patient, and I can price accordingly. Okay, here is indication-based pricing. It's not hard if you don't try to make sense of the whole graph, okay? So we'll do this very slowly. We'll do this very, very slowly, right? And you have to like promise me you're not paying attention. There are 4 graphs here. Don't pay attention to 4. Just pay attention to this graph here. This is a drug that can be used in 3 indications. Indication A, indication B, indication C, okay? The width of these bars is the number of patients who have the indication. The height of these bars is the value to the patient. Measured qualities, willingness to pay, we can talk about that. We're being very loose about it. The way I've drawn it, patients who have indication A have a very high willingness to pay for the drug, less so for indication B, less so for indication C. Why? It could be because the patients with indication C, they don't benefit a lot from the drug. So they have some willingness to pay, but it's small. And again, I keep saying patients, but the patient demand is being sort of, hopefully being transmitted to the payer.
And you can compute the consumer surplus.
Yeah. So I'm going to now compute the consumer surplus. So suppose we live in a world where the pharma company has no diagnostic tool. It doesn't know who has which indication. That was, for a lot of drugs, that is the case. And so what the pharma company will do is it will do uniform pricing. It will have the same price regardless of indication. The way I have drawn uniform pricing, I have this price set to the maximum willingness to pay for patients with indication C. So this pharma company decided it wanted to sell the drug to these patients, but to sell it to these patients, it had to set a price that was as high as their maximum willingness to pay. Now, it could set a price lower than that, but that's not what a for-profit company would do, right? It would set this price. Now, notice the consumer surplus that patients with indication A and B get. They get some consumer surplus, which, if you're not an economist, what this means is you paid a lower price than what you were willing to pay. You were willing to pay more than what you had to pay. And in general, we think that for a lot of services, there's some consumer surplus. You take an Uber ride from the airport to your house, you pay $25, but maybe your willingness to pay was $27. So you got $2 of consumer surplus, right? If Uber knew your actual willingness to pay, they would charge you $27, but they just don't know your exact willingness to pay. They're not able to customize the price to your exact willingness to pay. Okay, now here's what happens with, this is uniform pricing. This is how most drugs are priced. This is what happens with indication-based pricing. Here, the manufacturer has a test that tells it who has indication A, B, and C. The minute they have that test, they can charge a price equal to the maximum willingness to pay for those patients. And so the price in indication A goes up, the price in indication B goes up, the price in indication C stays the same. This company has made more profit by converting the consumer surplus that was being realized in the upper left into producer surplus, right? It has basically converted that consumer surplus that patients were getting into profit, right? So this is something that you can see pharmaceutical companies would like to do a lot of. So the question comes up, is this bad? Should we stop it? Is indication bad? I mean, like, these companies are already making lots of money. Do we want to help them make more money? And here's what makes indication-based pricing hard. Here is a situation where the company is practicing uniform pricing. Indication A and indication B patients are getting the drug. The price, you can see in my second figure, is higher than what I had over here. In this diagram, what the company decided to do was, it decided not to sell it to patients with indication C. It decided to sell it only to patients with indications A and B, so it was able to charge a higher price. It gave up all the patients with indication C, right? So these patients with indication C, don't get the drug, right? Because the price is higher than their maximum willingness to pay. So the pharma company is charging a higher price. It is getting more revenue from patients with indications A and B, but it's not getting revenue from patients with indication C. Now here comes why indication-based pricing is complicated and not just automatically a bad answer. With indication-based pricing, what happens is the pharma company can actually drop the price for patients with indication C. So it's able to sell the drug to patients with indication C and expand access. So they're not foregoing the drug. They're now getting the drug. It's true that they're getting their drug at their maximum willingness to pay, but we have expanded access to the drug, right? So whether or not you think indication-based pricing is a good thing or a bad thing should really turn on how many situations like this there are in the world. How many situations are there where there are patients who have indications that are not getting treated because the price is being set too high for them. The price is being set too high because there's other patients in more valuable conditions to manufacture. If you think that's not a problem, and that most of the world is this world, up here, then I think indication-based pricing is just mostly a transfer from patients to pharma companies, which may be okay if you think pharma companies need all that money to do R&D, but that might be a tougher sell, I think, from those voters. If you believe that this is the world that we live in, that there's a lot of cancers where the drug is being priced for the high-value conditions, so patients in the low-value conditions, low value doesn't mean no value, it just means low value. They get less benefit. They're certainly not getting as much benefit as the price of the drug. If we think that the world is mostly described by scenario 2, then moving to indication-based pricing could actually increase welfare. And so one of the things I'm engaged in is trying to figure out how much of this world do we live in versus this world do we live in. And I don't have a good answer for you. I mean, my research on this is a little bit all over the place. You know, in the early research we did, we found a lot of evidence for this. Now we're finding a lot of evidence for this. So if we do the conference again, I'll come back and tell you what I find. But let me give you a sense of what will happen with indication-based pricing. If you want magnitudes, you already have a sense, hopefully. By the way, for those of you who are not economists, you basically know most of economics now. Like this is most of economics. This is like the only thing we really know. Let me give you a sense of what indication-based pricing would do in the real world. So here are two very common drugs, Erbitux and Herceptin. Erbitux, let's talk about two indications in which it can be used. Indication 1, locally advanced squamous cell carcinoma of the head and neck. Indication 2, first-line treatment of recurrent or metastatic squamous cell carcinoma of the head and neck. These are different medical conditions. This is a deadly condition, right? Because it is metastatic. And so if I were to give you Erbitux, it would increase your survival by about 3 months, about 0.25, about a quarter of a year. In this condition, it would increase your survival by a little bit over a year and a half, okay? You can look at the typical treatment duration. It's longer over here. You shouldn't be confused by this, because what this is saying is, I gotta take the drug on average for 4 months. And if I take it for 4 months, it increases my survival by 3 months. That's the way to think about this. The monthly price is uniform in this model over here. So the manufacturer of Erbitux doesn't know who is in indication A, who is in indication B, so they charge them both a common price. Now, with your knowledge of economics, you know that this price was not completely made up, right? Like, I know that if you don't study pharma pricing, it just looks like these guys make up prices. But if you study economics, you know that this price reflects the maximum willingness to pay for patients with the low value indication. So if you know that patients who get 3 months of survival are willing to spend $10,000, you can back out what their implied value of life is. How much do they value life? And the answer is, if you're willing to cover this drug, which is 4 months of treatment at a monthly price of $10,000, so that's like $40,000, for a survival gain of 0.23 years, it must mean that you're valuing life at about $186,000. That's what it means. But if you tell me you're valuing life at $186,000, and over here I'm generating 1.64 years of life, I can tell you what the indication-based price is. And I can do that for you on the next slide. So if you're following along with me, you'll know that this price doesn't change. This was their maximum willingness to pay. This price will change, it will go up, right? The price on patients with indication, in indication A, in the high value indication, will rise from $10,000 to $220,000. So I think that we're going to start to see, these are old drugs, that this is not even the kind of heterogeneity that we're seeing with some of the new novel precision therapeutics, but, well, I don't know what happened here. Okay, but you can see over here, this price went from $10,000 to $220,000. Huge, massive increase in price. The reason that you'll see this massive increase in price is because the manufacturer, once it's known that it's being used in this condition, will say, aha, for these guys you're willing to value life at $185,000 per life year. If I just use that same value of life for the high value people, I can probably get away with about $220,000. Now you could say, well, but you did value of life, you didn't do value of life in perfect health. All of that is true. I just wanted to illustrate what some very simple economic insights would predict about the kind of pricing dynamics that we're likely to see with precision medicines in the years to come. Okay, that was my first point, that there's been this change in pricing dynamics. We're likely to see much more pricing like this. My second point was, there are orphan drugs that are increasingly getting non-orphan indications. And you can see this over here. We took all the drugs, all the approved orphan drugs since the start of the Orphan Drug Act, and you can see about a quarter of them have non-orphan indications. Right, so about a quarter of drugs, a quarter of orphan drugs are used in indications where we have more than 200,000 patients. So they're not technically pure orphan drugs, right? And the world's, you can kind of see the breakdown of all of this. In some of these cases, the company got the orphan indication first, and then went and got the non-orphan indications. In some of these cases, the company got the non-orphan indication first, and then actually went and got the orphan indication second. I think all of this really comes to light with the case of Humira. Humira is a drug, and I'll tell you more about Humira in a second, where 98% of its revenue comes from rheumatoid arthritis, the non-orphan indication, right? Over time, this is what the approval sequence for Humira looks like. You can see it was approved in December of 2002 for rheumatoid arthritis, gigantic condition. But in bold, you can see the pediatric conditions coming online. So these are the pediatric orphan conditions. So juvenile idiopathic arthritis, Humira receives approval for that. This is an orphan condition. HS, it receives orphan indication in 2015. Uveitis in 2016, right? Pediatric Crohn's in 2014. These are all orphan indications. Now we know that the drug was already clearly economically viable. So I wanted to do a small aside because there is a tension, I think, between economists and clinicians on this behavior. I think there's a lot of clinicians, I don't want to generalize and say all clinicians, but a lot of clinicians just view this subsequent indication seeking by pharmaceutical companies as gaming. They just say, they're just gaming the whole system, getting more and more indications. There's no social value in getting new indications. Well, I think whether or not there's social value in getting new indications is really an empirical question. And the empirical answer depends on whether or not the use of the drug increases after you get the next indication. So in other words, if there's new information that comes to market about the drug being safe and effective in one of these orphan conditions, and doctors and patients say, wow, you did this new trial, the drug is safe and effective in this new condition, I will now use the drug, that could be socially valuable. But it could also be socially not valuable if doctors and patients have already figured out that the drugs work in these orphan indications. If they've already figured it out through off-label use or experimentation, then we don't want to provide this additional indication to the companies. And so what we find in the case of Humira is sort of a mixed piece of evidence. Here are the different indications for Humira, the orphan indications. And you can see you know, like here it is getting the orphan indication for juvenile idiopathic arthritis. There's really no increase in its use before and after the indication in this condition, meaning that doctors and patients knew that the drug could be used in juvenile idiopathic arthritis. It didn't need that extra certification from the FDA. But in something like HS, right? In HS, you see a very sharp increase after the new indication comes in. So this is socially valuable, right? This is more use for patients with this drug. These patients were clearly not getting the drug for this indication before. Maybe the health plans, the insurers were saying no. Maybe there was just uncertainty about whether this rheumatoid arthritis drug would actually work for this condition. Whatever it is, I think the first graph is an example of, you know, an indication, new indication generating some social value, and in the other graphs I don't have evidence of that. So I think these statements around companies are gaming the indications process is I think it's made very often, but I think we should evaluate this claim empirically.
So when you're mapping the order of whether some study has an orphan drug piece and not, are you looking at the same drug label or the actual drug? Because some companies change the name and it's the exact same thing.
Right, so we're not even counting that.
Okay.
We're not even counting that. We're saying literally the same drug. So Humira, it's not like they tweaked the drug for this.
Right.
So, but you're saying, yeah, but this could be like Avastin and Lucentis, right, which are basically the same drug. They tweaked it just a little bit to sell it, to do price discrimination for macular degeneration. We're not even counting that. I'm sure there's some of that going on.
Yeah, there's the other one, whatever the erectile dysfunction drug is,
Yeah.
also has the same.
Yep.
And they just changed it so
Yeah.
that you're not being diagnosed that.
Yeah, so we're not talking about little squiggles that they might do to the isomer structure to change the drug. They might be doing that too. We're talking about when they don't change the active moiety or whatever. It's just literally the same molecule, the same biologic, the same protein.
And the same name.
And the same name. Right, exactly. So this probably understates the degree to which those kinds of behaviors are prevalent. And those are all ways of doing price discrimination, right? This is indication-based pricing is a simpler way to do the price discrimination. I think in the old days they had to tweak the molecule a little bit to do it. Okay, so let me make my third point about natural monopolies. If you look at all drugs approved between 2084 and 2011, we wanted to stop the analysis in 2011 because we wanted to see, since 2011, how many of these drugs have actually faced generic entry. And if you look at non-orphan drugs, about 51% of non-orphan drugs have faced generic entry after the patents and exclusivity periods expired. In orphan drugs, it's a lot smaller. It's about 33%. So this is that way, a very simple way of kind of getting to this point that we're more likely to see natural monopoly-like conditions with orphan drugs. We're less likely to see follow-on generic entry. The manufacturers of orphan drugs are likely to have market power for much longer than the manufacturers of non-orphan drugs. Yes?
I'm just curious whether the length of time you wait to account for entry of generic is the same for both cases. Because if orphan drugs are more recent, maybe some of the generics.
Oh, right. So this is, yeah, exactly. Yeah, totally right. So this is just a high-level graph. And then in the paper, we kind of go through it and do it with your fixed effects. So you're comparing, you know, an orphan and a non-orphan that were both brought to market in the same year. Yeah. So I'm not showing you those regressions because I just wanted to leave you with a high level. But it's still absolutely true. In fact, it becomes a little bit more true because the orphans are coming out much later than the non-orphans. Just a little bit more true than us. Okay, so that was the point about you know, if these ultra orphans, and I don't have ultra orphans here, by the way, because here I'm just drawing a line between non-orphan and orphan. In the paper, we spend some time looking at the different types of orphan. Orphan just means fewer than 200,000 people. Ideally, what you want to look at is, for the smaller orphans, is there even less generic entry? And the answer is yes. But I just wanted to leave you with this takeaway because this is easy to remember. The tables and the regression results are just not that easy to remember. But you can see this pattern is basically saying the smaller the market size, the less followed on competition from generics and biosimilars, which in an era of precision medicine could mean huge kind of monopoly brands for some of these manufacturers. So what I thought I would leave us with is a couple of questions, right? And so now I'm doing something I don't usually do, but I'm wandering away from the research into the policy space a little bit. And I wanted to kind of think about a couple of issues, which is, let's go back to this Orphan Drug Act and ask, if we want to provide incentives for orphan drugs, how should we do it? And when I think about this question as an economist, I think that the answer requires us to answer two questions. First, which products do we target? And second, how do we target the incentives? The products we've been targeting so far use this very crude threshold. Does your disease have fewer than 200,000 people? If yes, then we'll target your product. And we'll target it in the form of R&D tax credits and more monopoly power. Those are the current answers to those two questions. My own view is, I think we should move away from that 200,000 and think much harder about which are the products that have little market potential. Which are the products that are close to that minimal threshold required to do the R&D and bring the drug to market? They may not be products for small diseases. It could be that, just to make the point, it could be that malaria drugs qualify.
Antibiotics will qualify.
Yeah, right, exactly, because these are huge diseases, but there's just not a lot of money to be made. In the case of antibiotics, the manufacturers have a very hard time capturing the social spillovers from reducing infectious disease. With malaria, the willingness to pay is incredibly low. So it could be that malaria killed 600,000 people last year, but the actual ability to make money off of a malaria drug is very, very small. So maybe we should be thinking orphan drug, not in the sense of small disease in the sense of number of patients, but small market size, which is patients times price, right? And I think there's a whole bunch of drugs that would qualify for this orphan designation then. And a bunch of other drugs, Luxturna, Humira, would not qualify. Maybe a lot of the precision medicines that we're talking about today would not qualify. So I get in a lot of trouble for saying this in Boston, which is sort of the epicenter of manufacturing these orphan drugs. But I think as economists, it's not our job to keep companies in business. Our job is to advocate on the side of social welfare. And it's not clear to me that we should be thinking about subsidizing the orphan drugs that can command high prices and be economically viable. I just think that's a poor use of limited public dollars. So that's kind of one thing I'm wrestling with. We don't say this in the paper because it's a sort of a political point, but I think it's one that we should grapple with. The second point is, how do you structure it? So suppose you've identified the product. Now you have to think about how it's structured. Well, the current way we structure it is mostly to give these companies extra monopoly power. But if you think about that incentive, it's a weird incentive, because how does a company with extra monopoly power actually make money? What it does is it charges higher prices. Who does it charge the higher prices to? To patients with orphan disease. Patients with non-orphan disease will not pay the high price. It does seem from a Rawlsian justice point of view, but this is a weird way to subsidize the creation of orphan drugs. We're basically telling patients with orphan disease, well, sorry you have orphan disease. That's horrible. Now pay more for your orphan drug. I kind of feel to the extent that a lot of these diseases have a genomic basis to them, their R&D should be subsidized by all of us, not just the patients who have the disease. So we should be financing it much more through general revenue than out-of-pocket spending by patients who have orphan diseases or high premiums for patients who have orphan diseases. But subsidizing it through general revenue means financing it through the R&D tax credit, not the extra monopoly power we're giving these companies. So I would actually argue that like maybe what we should be doing is that the tax credit from this Rawlsian point of view is actually more superior than the orphan exclusivity, and unfortunately we in the US, which is sort of the largest market for these drugs, have moved in exactly the wrong direction. We've dialed down the orphan tax credit. Now I would say actually maybe we should not have dialed it down. We should have perhaps dialed it up, Philippe.
Well, if you had public insurance, then that would be a way to finance it.
Yeah, public insurance financed through general revenue would be a great way to finance it. Yeah, that would be, that's all the same, like just do it through general revenue. I think EU law and Japanese law also have some insights for us. So EU and Japan allow you to claw back the subsidy if the drug turns out to be economically viable down the road. So that's really exciting because it's saying to these companies, we'll give you all the incentives we promised you. But if it turns out that your drugs were economically viable, so in other words, we tell Sparks Therapeutics, you want to write off your R&D and all, that's fine. But like if your company is worth $1 billion or $5 billion, we think you're economically viable. They only have one drug, so it's not like Sparks' market valuation reflects a portfolio of drugs. And so that's a way of saying to companies, you know, we will happily subsidize the drug, but we will take back the benefit if it turns out that your drug is commercially viable. That's much harder to do. I don't know how Congress will ever write the law that the EU and the Japanese have written, but in theory you could write such laws. I would much prefer to do it, you know, in this other way where we're not having to claw things back. So let me just leave you with those thoughts. You know, I think my final thought is that there are these drugs, orphan drugs, which will not see follow-on competition because of the tiny, small market nature of the drug. And there, maybe there's an activist role for cost-based price regulation. Now, cost-based price regulation is much easier to do than just general cost-based price regulation of this industry. Because this industry is doing a lot of R&D. We don't really know how to think about failure and risk and the cost of R&D. Cost-based price regulation for a drug that's already come to the market is much easier to do because you just need to know information about marginal cost. You don't need to know fixed cost, you just need to know marginal cost. Marginal cost, getting data on marginal cost is much easier to collect for a company that we're trying to regulate. So again, those are just some ideas. I don't think any of them are ready for prime time, but what got me really excited about coming to this conference was it's been my view that precision medicines will amplify all of these concerns in the years to come. And so what better than to discuss these issues with people who are knowledgeable about precision medicines. Thank you.